This is Humanities in the Western Tradition, Lecture 5, Greek Art. When we ask why we should study history, the historian answers we must know about the past in order to have a sense of who we are, and where we may be going. This argument also holds true for the arts. There's more to art history than memorizing dates. Examining a work in its historical, social, political context will help you have a more meaningful dialogue with that work. Look at the 4 pieces of art right here. These 4 statues represent the human form. On the far left, we have Hellenic, archaic Greek art. The second piece is a Roman art, a Roman emperor. The third piece is from a medieval cathedral, these figures of angels and prophets. And the fourth piece is a Renaissance piece. The similarities are there. They're all human forms, but there are some distinct differences. These pieces range from the ideal, something not very naturalistic, not very realistic, to something very realistic, and back again to an ideal of form. There are variances, choices that painters, sculptors, architects use. Each artist uses the tools of his trade. Painters use composition and movement, unity and balance, color, light and dark contrast, and mood. In architecture, we see rhythm, scale, light, line, texture, color, ornament, acoustics of the site, space and weight and mass of the piece. In sculpture, we see form and position, as well as all of those same elements that we see in painting. We see depth and movement. Why do we look at these arts? Why do we look at these pieces? We group them by historical period because things made at about the same time and in the same place will have some common stylistic elements. That is, they'll look similar. And in the West, as style changes, we can date objects roughly based on how they look. However, what you will notice is certain elements, proportion and perspective, come and go. Other things, like columns and arches in architecture, remain fairly consistent. How do you learn to recognize an artistic style? You look at a lot of images. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at a lot of works of art and talk about them. In the ancient world, works of art were done usually under the auspices of a patronage system. Artists didn't set up shop and hope passers-by would stop in and buy a painting or two. In antiquity, the creator is usually the one with the money. Things don't get made unless somebody pays an artist or an artisan to have it made. People don't generally spend money on anything without a purpose, to commemorate something or to demonstrate their wealth. The Greek representation of the objective world varies from idealistic to realistic. And sometimes people ask whether these artists were simply unskilled at matching hand and eye, so to speak, and couldn't draw what they saw. But such a question presupposes that the objective of the artist has always been to match appearances with camera-like exactitude. That's not the case, nor is it the case that artists of one period see more correctly or render more skillfully than those of another. Rather, it's that artists represent what they conceive to be real, not what they perceive with their eyes, but what they feel has meaning. The Greeks' representation of the objective world is instilled in them by their culture. They understand the visible world in certain unconscious, culturally agreed on ways, and thus bring to the artistic process ideas and meanings out of a common stock. They record not so much what they know or mean. At the same time, Greece is a powerful state. The Greek city-states control the north edge of the Mediterranean with their sailing ships. They trade and are impacted by other cultures. We've heard about the Persians. All of these Mediterranean influences and Mediterranean colonies influenced Hellenic art and especially later Hellenistic art. Hellenic being the art of the Hellenes or the Greeks, and Hellenistic is art that is like the Greeks, influenced by other cultures. We're going to begin with Hellenic art, and there are three basic periods we're going to talk about. The geometric period, 9th to 8th century BCE, is most known for its pottery ornamented with geometric designs and of simplified friezes of simplified animals and humans. The Archaic period, 600 to 480 BCE, includes stone figures and vase paintings, mostly idealistic, but also beginning to see some movement. And the Classical period, 480 to 323, is the peak of Greek art and architecture, in which idealized figures exemplify order and harmony. Mostly we will focus on this one. Hellenistic style, which we'll talk about in another lecture, is a Greek-derived style found in Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, Egypt, more melodramatic than classical style. And in every source here that we use, Hellenistic and Hellenic both represent similar Greek values. The Greek world encompasses the area of the northern Mediterranean. There are Greek colonies on the western edge of Asia Minor, the Greek peninsula, the Peloponnesian peninsula, and all the way into Sicily, Syracuse, and the southern edge of Italy. So the Greeks trade, and they trade with Crete. They trade around the Mediterranean, and we'll see many of the Greek art pieces influenced by cultures from these areas, as well as being spread to other cultures impacting these. The first thing we're going to talk about today is vases. These are vessel shapes. These are some of the most common forms that pottery takes, and you can see they have a number of shapes. Number 2 here is a basic pitcher for pouring. Number 4, the amphora, is a storage vessel. These are the kinds of things we find on ships holding grain or olive oil or wine. The kylix in the center there, number 5, is a drinking vessel. It's a two-handled cup from which you would drink wine. All of these vessels have various purposes, and all of them come, as we find them, decorated with stories of heroes and gods, Greek myths, as well as contemporary subjects like warfare and drinking parties. The earliest vase design is the geometric design. The figures and ornaments are primarily geometric figures. Archaic period was the great age of vase painting, and the highly realistic early classical style began in the 5th century. Black figure technique begins in the early century, 7th century BCE. The piece, the Diplodon crater, circa 8th century. In black figure painting, the artist first sketches figures with a lead or charcoal stick on a red clay vase, and then fills in figures with slip, a wet clay mixture. When fired, the slip turns black, and the unpainted part of the vase remains red. Details are added with purple or red dyed slip. Gradually, black figure painting is going to be replaced by a reverse process known as red figure technique, which is invented around 530 BCE. In red figure technique, the artist will sketch the figures and then incise a border around them, then paint in details with slip, and then paint in the background with slip, which blackens in the kiln right up to the incised border. The various shapes of Greek vessels develop according to purpose and the Greek interest in aesthetic forms. But by the Archaic period, we see these specialized forms associated with specific functions. The Diplodon crater is a good example of black figure technique. It dates from the 8th century BCE. This is a period in which Greece is developing commerce among its various city-states. There is a prosperous economy. One of the major products is pottery, and this is demonstrating the very earliest artistic beginnings of the Greeks. This crater, or vessel, liquid-holding vessel, is called the Diplodon crater, named for the cemetery where it was found. It marked the grave of an Athenian man buried around 740 BCE. It's well over 3 feet tall. It shows considerable technique and technical skill on the part of the potter, and it also shows the wealth and position of the deceased's family in the community. There are two distinct pictorial bands, but other than that, the entire body of the vase is decorated with geometric motifs, some of which may have been inspired by patterns of woven baskets. If you notice down toward the base, there's a sort of a herringbone kind of basket weave pattern. At the top, you can see a meander or key pattern around the rim of the crater. The painting is very meticulous. These forms are rigidly rendered. The subject of the vase is a funeral procession, and it's depicted in the wider bands at the top. At the very top band, we see highly abstract female figures. Notice that their torsos are like triangles. This is a geometric period. In the center there is the bier, the funeral pile on which rests the horizontal figure of the deceased. The band below features figures of warriors with what's called apple core shields. These are teams of chariots. The deceased is probably a Greek soldier, and so the motifs of warfare down in the bottom go along with his life. This would be left in at the grave site, open at the bottom is open to allow liquids to drain out, whether rainwater, or you might come and pour in a drink of wine for the deceased, a toast to the deceased, and the liquid drains out the bottom, but it is there at the grave site in an offering to the deceased. This particular piece is called Eluis, The Blinding of Polyphemus and the Gorgons. This is an Oriental style amphora. An amphora is a vessel that might hold wine or grain or some product that you want to transport. This is kind of a complete break from the orderly geometric period. The design of this vase is rather casual and it flows a little better. You can see more movement. If you notice, the figures in the top still have those triangular torsos, but they're a little bit more human-like. The neck up here depicts a scene from the Odyssey in which Odysseus and his companions burn out the eye of the one-eyed giant Cyclops. Odysseus pulls off this stunt by first getting the giant drunk. You can see the wine cup in the Cyclops' hand, and as the giant dozes off and is drunk, Odysseus and his men get a spear that they have sharpened in a fire and poke out the Cyclops' eye, which allows them to escape from his cave. Homeric tales were collected during the geometric period. This vase has one of the earliest identifiable depictions of a scene from Greek mythology. The Homeric myths become central topics of Greek art for centuries. We also see a Mesopotamian influence in these figures. Odysseus and his men look a little bit like Mesopotamians. The animals in the middle band and the Gorgons in the bottom, the Gorgons are sisters of the Medusa, monstrous women, also have a sort of Near East flavor. But the Greeks add their own playful charm to these monsters. If you look closely, you can see that the bug-eyed Gorgons down in the bottom are showing off their legs, a little bit like modern can-can dancers. Here's a close-up of that scene of blinding the Cyclops. Odysseus is the white figure and his men behind him in black, and you can see the wine cup in Polyphemus's hand. The next piece here is a kylix, or a drinking vessel. It's a low, flat bowl with handles, usually for drinking wine. This is by Ezekias. It's Dionysius on a sailboat, circa 550 to 525 BCE. And the scene you're seeing right here is as you look down into the cup. So you would be drinking your wine, and once your wine was emptied away, you could look down into the cup and see this image of Dionysus, the god Dionysus on a sailboat. Dionysus is the god of wine and debauchery, partying. He's basically a party god. This kylix shows Dionysus sailing over the sea in a boat, carrying his gifts to mankind. He's accompanied by dolphins. The story here is that Dionysus took ship with some sailors, and while he was on the boat, the sailors thought that he fell asleep. They thought they'd rob him and throw him overboard. He had rich clothes on. And so when they go to lay hands on him, the god wakes up and demonstrates that he is in fact a god. The sailboat, the mast of the sailboat sprouts vines and grapes, and the sailors in fear leap overboard and are turned into dolphins. So Dionysus here is sailing along. You see he's got his drinking horn in his hand. He can enjoy his sail. The thing that's most interesting here is that he doesn't show a conventional image that reads as a sail. It's a sort of almost a geometric form, but it is clearly a sail. It's bellied out with the wind. There's a sense of motion and a sense of movement in this, with the dolphins around the base of the ship leaping and frolicking. And this particular piece manifests an increasing comprehension by the Greeks of the physical nature as it is seen in the vision of the artist. It's a beautiful piece. Here's a detail. You can see how the sailboat sail gives an impression of a three dimensions. The details in the railings on the ship, and even the ship itself, has now acquired a dolphin nose and a fish-like aspect because of the god. This piece is called The Death of Sarpedon. Sarpedon was a Trojan hero. He was killed by Patroclus, Achilles' friend, and he's being carried here on this piece by two Greek gods, Thanatos and Morpheus, sleep and death. Between the two, in between Thanatos and Morpheus, is Hermes. He carries the caduceus, and you see his wings on his hat. He is the messenger of the gods. He's there to lead the soul of the slain warrior to the underworld, to the god Hades. And you can see movement in this piece. The body is twisted just as if it is limp, and as you would lift a limp body of a fallen hero. And you see blood flowing from the wound. You see these angular lines, these sort of organic movement in this piece. This conveys a physical and an emotional presence that's kind of new to Greek vase painting as well. Somber facial emotions betray the tragic loss. A thing that's really notable here is that this is a story concerning an enemy of the Greeks, and yet it's featured on such a fine, large vase produced by one of the leading Athenian artists, Euphrainios. We can see details of anatomy and drapery more naturalistically rendered, and even in the bands of decoration, we have less geometric and more organic curling and floral images. Overall, just a gorgeous piece. We're going to turn now to sculpture. This piece is an 8th century bronze horse, and I want you to note particularly how stylized it is. You would never see a horse with this kind of nose that's sort of round and flat, or this narrow body, but all of these combined lines give a distinct impression of horse, and they also give a sense of sort of the delicacy and the movement of a horse. This is the earliest form of statue, this idealized, sort of stylized imagery, the impression of horse. We're going to see the same human figure. This piece is called a kouros. Kouros simply means young man. The kouros is and there are several of these kinds of statues that are found almost always in the same exact pose. They are statues of young men. They may have been dedicated to a god. The female version of this is called Kore, and we'll see them on a future slide here. This figure for the Greeks represents an athletic ideal, a new understanding of the organic nature of the human body. The shape of the body adheres essentially to the block of marble from which it's carved. The arms are close to the body, the fists are clenched tightly, one leg advances, but only very slightly. The emphasis is in harsh and sort of patterned lined. Muscles flex unrealistically. This is a human body, but it is a sort of an idea of a human body. Muscles, you can see the lines of the abdomen. You can see the shin, the musculature around the knee. There is a stylization to the hair. It's very, very Egyptian looking, very stylized, straight, and yet you can see texture to it. When Greek athletes competed nude in the Olympic Games held during religious festivals, nudity also demonstrates Greek attitudes toward body and beauty and integrity of the human body. The slight smile is an archaic design, suggesting a confidence, assurance consistent with the energy of the body. This piece recognizes both psychological and emotional aspects of human life. Some of the koros and kore are inscribed with the name of the artists. On the base, it might say, "So and so made me," or with dedications to various deities, usually Apollo. These are like votive offerings. Most cases, we don't know whether the statues represent a donor, a deity, or a person deemed divinely favored, such as a victor in athletic games. Those placed on graves may have represented the person buried beneath. In very rare cases, a kouros stands guard over a female battle site, but we see these kouros throughout archaic Greek period. The kore is the female version of the kouros. Both kore and kouros, there is no real effort made to individualize the statue as a portrait. They don't look like a particular person, so they represent the dead only in a very general sense. It makes most sense to think of these as ideals of physical perfection and vitality shared by mortals and immortals alike, given meaning by their physical context. Only the wealthy could afford to erect them, since many were well over life size and carved from high quality marble. By erecting a sculpture of this kind, a wealthy person declares his or her status and claims membership in a ruling elite circles. This particular female kore is clothed. Now, here's a thing that's distinctly different between the male and the female. You always find the female kore clothed. You always find the male kouros naked. The Greeks held that the human body was beautiful. But remember, woman is to be cherished and protected. You don't want her seen naked in public. So the Greek kore is always wearing a dress. The dress she wears here is called a peplos, and that's what gives this kore the name, a peplos kore. Touches of paint remain on the sculpture, giving it a kind of lifelike gaze and a sensitive expression. Most of these sculptures were painted. The woman's body is composed in graceful, sort of columnal lines, echoing in the delicate play of the long braids that grace her shoulders. As in the case of the kouros figure, she remains close to the shape of the marble block. You can see the rectangle of the marble from which she is carved. In this case, her missing left arm was extended. She probably once held in her hand an attribute that would identify the figure as a maiden or as a goddess, some element, something that was unique to the goddess figure, perhaps Athena herself. Although the function of kore figures is also unknown, some have interpreted them as votive sculpture because we tend to find kore among the ruins of temples, where we find the kouros among the gravestones and burial sites. This peplos kore was buried for more than 2 millennia, which protected the painted surface from destructive elements of atmosphere and bad weather. Along with other statues, she had been knocked over by the Persians during their sack of the Acropolis in 480 BC, and shortly thereafter the Athenians buried all the damaged sculpture. She probably lost her arm in that attack by the Persians, and was buried then and not to be found until millennia later. Some details from the Corée. You can see the waves in her hair, the paint on the eyes, the mouth, the little smile. The Corée and the Koros tend to have these little Mona Lisa sort of smiles. Details on the back of her garment show trim painted on it. She's softer than the Koros. The Koros is a little bit more masculine, a little harder lines. She's a little softer. You get the sense of a very young woman, a very beautiful woman. Here's another sculpture that in seeing the male nude form again. This one is called the Critios boy. This is also a form of Kouros statue, which was excavated from the debris the Persians left behind after the Athenian Acropolis. This figure is a little bit different in that it combines flexed and relaxed muscles. Although the feet are lost, the figure survives enough to reveal that this was represented in a relaxed and realistic position known as weight shift or contrapposto. The leg that carries the main leg is called the engaged leg. That's the leg in the back. The other leg, the free leg. The simple observation of this kind of position in human form and then its replication in statue is a radical change. With it comes the idea that if one part of the body is engaged in a task standing, the other parts respond. Bending the free knee results in a slight swivel of the pelvis, compensating curvature of the spine. You almost see a little bit of an S curve from his shoulders down to his knees. This sort of unified approach to the body led artists to represent movement more with a new natural realism. Even though the Critios boy is at rest, his muscles suggest motion. This sculpture has life. He seems capable of taking a step, of moving. To understand the revolutionary quality of this particular Kouros, we have to view it as a Greek Buddha in the period. The pose would have seemed startlingly new and amazingly naturalistic. It's a softness, an organic unity in the articulation of the muscles. The sculptor seems to have breathed life into the stone itself. After this, sculpture will never be the same. The use of contrapposto, or this relaxed leg position, this weight shift position on legs, separates classical from archaic Greek statuary. Its reappearance after a long absence is going to be one of the hallmarks of the renewed interest in classical art during the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance. You can see the detail of his face here. His eyes are missing because they were probably carved from precious stones, and those may have been pried out and looted. But he also has a facial expression that you can almost see emotion in. There's a slight curve to the lips, almost whimsy. His hair is patterned in curls. This is a much more realistic sort of body image than the earlier Kouros figures had. In 470 BC, we see another sort of variation here. This is the charioteer of Delphi. This statue is almost all that remains of an enormous group which was comprised of a driver, a chariot, a team of horses, and a young groom. The patron who commissioned the work intended it as an offering to Apollo and a commemoration of the victory of his team and charioteer in the Delphic games. The moment for depiction is not during the race, but after, when the driver quietly and modestly holds his horses still in the winner's circle. He has the reins in his outstretched right hand. He wears the standard charioteer's garment. It has a high waistline, a high girdle, and is held at his shoulders and back to keep it from flapping as he drives the team. The folds both emphasize verticality and the calm of the figure. They're not moving, he's standing still, and they recall the flutes of a Greek column. You'll see this later. A band inlaid with silver is tied around the head to confine the hair. The eyes were made of glass paste and were shaded by delicate bronze lashes. You see the details in the garment much, much more detail than you saw in the peplos chore, for instance. This is the movement toward classical art. There's a little detail on the right. You get a little bit better view of his face there. Here's another piece from around 460 to 450 BCE. This is either Zeus or Poseidon. We don't know for sure. It was found, recovered from the sea near the Greek coast. This is a 7-foot tall figure. In this single figure, the sculpture captures and contrasts vigorous action and firm stability. This is a work of grandeur, revealing the god's awe-inspiring power. He had in his right hand either a thunderbolt or a trident. Most likely this is Zeus, a less likely suggestion that this was Poseidon with his trident. But there is energetic movement here, communicated by tensed muscles in the torso and abdomen. Distended veins, you can see the veins in his arms. There's a position that is buoyant on the balls of the feet, with the back foot lifting up, the heel lifting up, the front foot stepping forward. You can see in the lifting of the toe on the forward foot. This is a piece. This is a figure almost ready to move. There are 3 prongs. This is a bronze piece. There are 3 prongs in the foot that holds it to its position on the base. The pose expresses the perfect physical development of the god and his complete physical control, while his severe facial expression complements this aggressive action of being ready to throw his thunderbolt or his trident. This kind of a position would be impossible to do in marble, because marble lacks the tensile strength and would not allow outstretched arms, while the pose of feet and legs would not support the weight of the upper body. This hollow case statue is both light and stable. Because of its greater possibilities for both natural effects and convincing movement, bronze began to become a favored sculpture material for the Greeks after the Archaic period. But very few ancient Greek bronzes have survived. In many cases, they were melted down and the bronze reused. In this figure, the color of the bronze suggests a naturally suntanned, oiled bodies. The ancient Greeks oiled their bodies while exercising, and the inlaid eyes and teeth, fringed sheet bronze eyelashes, and inlaid colored nipples reinforce this natural effect of the statue. This particular piece is one of the greatest freestanding sculptures of the classical era. It was created by Polykleitos. His favorite medium was bronze, and this particular piece we have here is a Roman marble copy of a Greek bronze original. The Greek bronze would have been dated 450 to 440 BCE. The Doryphoros, or spear bearer, is the modern name. Polykleitos himself called it canon. He wrote a treatise on human proportion called the Canon, from Greek kanon, rule establishing a set of ideal proportions for a human figure. His illustration of measurements revealed in the treatise is the work we know as the Doryphoros. This is an ideal figure because of its proportions adhere to common fractions of the figure's height. Since both Polykleitos' original figure and the text are lost, the precise measurements he was proposing are undetermined, but the later Roman writer Vitruvius advocated a rule whereby the head, from the crown of the hair to the chin, is 1/8 of the total height of the body. The width of the shoulders is 1/4 of the height of the body, and so on, until every anatomical feature and all the proportions are given to us in a system of mathematical measurements. Using those mathematical measurements, sculptors could make much, much more realistic figures. The Doryphoros is also the culmination of the evolution in Greek statuary from the archaic Kouros to the Critias boy. Now we see that same contrapposto form that we saw in the Critios boy, but it's more pronounced than ever. Polykleitos was not content simply rendering a figure that stands naturally. His aim was to impose order on human movement, to make it beautiful, to perfect human movement. The firm muscle musculature of the statue is enlivened by the contrapposto stance. The subject of this sculpture, which probably depicts an ideal Olympic athlete, is less important than the fact that it demonstrates this system of perfect proportions. About a century before the Doryphoros was created, Pythagoras, an ancient Greek philosopher and mathematician, presented mathematical proportion as the basis of musical harmony. Polykleitos' proportional system was more than a set of abstract principles, for it relates the Greek belief in agreement between natural and mathematical harmony, a belief that brings new vitality to the human figure in sculpture and to the visual arts in general. This particular piece, the Aphrodite of Knidos, is perhaps the most famous work of another Greek sculptor, Praxiteles. This is one of the first life-size figures in Greek art to depict the female nude, and the first time a goddess is portrayed in nude in a monumental statue. Her nudity is explained by the vase and drapery under her left hand. She is either entering or leaving her bath. You can see the vessel down below, the amphora that has water in it for her, and the robe that she's clutching in her hand to wrap around her or dry her body. Her head is slightly turned, so she's not looking directly at the viewer, but the viewer is aware that he or she has inappropriately witnessed the goddess in her nudity. By some accounts, Praxiteles' sculpture was displayed in a circular shrine with entrances at front and back, so visitors could view her from all sides. Pliny, another writer, records that the people of Kos commissioned a nude statue of Aphrodite from the master sculptor, but rejected it in favor of a draped version. The inhabitants of Knidos purchased the nude statue and profited from the risk. Her fame spread fast, and visitors came from far and wide to see her. Perhaps it was the nudity that drew so much attention. Female nudity had been reserved in art for representations of slaves or courtesans, prostitutes. However, even the drapery of clothed figures was so clingy that it revealed almost as much as it concealed. We know this statue only from Roman copies of it, and yet it comes down the ages as this ideal of feminine beauty. Look at her, the soft curve of her breasts, the curve of her belly, her legs, and again, she's in that contrapposto stance, one leg back, one leg forward. She's her hips slightly kilted, her shoulders slightly kilted. This is a woman at rest, a woman comfortable in herself. Another piece by Praxiteles, circa 320 to 310, is called Hermes and the Infant Dionysus. Praxiteles was a sculptor of the highest rank in the mid-4th century. He was an Athenian. Unlike most other sculptors who seem to have preferred bronze at his time, he excelled in carving. He translated harsh marble surfaces into subtly modeled flesh, and his skill was unsurpassed. The Hermes is delicately carved, realistic in its musculature, suggesting a keen observation of nature rather than sculpting along the lines of a rigid canon. This could be a real man. The messenger god holds the infant Dionysus, the god of wine, in his left arm, which is propped up by a tree trunk covered with a drape. Now, the reason for that is that by itself, this sculpture would fall over if it didn't have that third support. So the reason for the tree trunk and the drape is to simply balance the figure in its weight to keep it from falling. The statue's got a broken right arm, but it reaches out in front of him. Some suggest that Hermes may have once held a bunch of grapes toward which the infant is reaching. You see in here another perfect male form. Note the difference between the solid muscularity of Hermes and the soft, chubby body of the infant Dionysus. The rough treatment of Hermes' hair contrasted with the ivory smoothness of his skin, deeply carved and billowing drapery against the solidity of the body. This realism is enhanced by the use of a double weight shift principle. Hermes shifts his weight from the right leg to the left arm, resting it on the tree. The resultant stance is known as an S curve because the contours of the body form the S curve, the S shape, around an imaginary vertical axis. The surface treatment of the marble here is masterful, contrasting highly polished skin with rough, almost impressionistic hair. The group has a humorous quality typical of Praxiteles' work. The messenger god dangling a bunch of grapes in front of Dionysus, whose keen interest and attempts to reach them foretell his eventual role as the god of wine. Yet, depending upon a viewer's mood or worldview, Hermes' distant gaze may also hold a callous regard for the child's efforts. This was found at the Temple of Hera in Olympia in 1877 and was long thought to be a real classical marble carved by Praxiteles. However, now sculptors or historians think it is possibly a Roman copy from the 1st century CE. So, to recap a little bit, we see this movement in archaic sculpture from the rigid, stiff stances of the late 500s archaic period, the Kouros, to the Critias boy, where we see a more relaxed, softer human form. Muscles are present, musculature is emphasized, but it is not the stark geometric musculature of the archaic period. In the early classical period, we see an almost idealized form of musculature again that is but is in a more organic stance, a more realistic pose with more expression to the features. And by the time we get to the golden age of classical Greek art, Hellenic art, we see this Dionysus sculpture, Dionysus and Hermes, with its soft S curve form. The muscles are realistic, naturalistic, and the face has expression. The whole piece has movement. Can you see the progression here? How Greek art has changed, how Greek sculpture has changed over these several hundred years. Move on now to architecture. The Greeks invented three orders or architectural formulas: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. The order is based on the diameter of a column, with other elements following from this measure to create a structural harmony in architecture. Temples were treated as sculptures and had the same rules of symmetry and ideal proportions as in sculpture. There was sculpture in temples. It's usually put in the frieze at the top or the pediment at the base of the temple. Here we see these three orders of columns. If you notice the top of the columns, the Doric columns here, we have a shaft of the column. These are fluted. There's a groove cut in them. It takes away some of the weight. But Doric columns refer to the standard components. Doric order refers to the standard components of a Doric temple, usually found on mainland Greece. It is evolved in the late 7th century BCE. The Ionic order was more widespread in the Greek settlements of Asia Minor and the Aegean. The Roman architectural historian Vitruvius wrote that Greek architecture was based on the human form, and he compared the Doric style to a sturdy male and the Ionic order to a slender female form. The signature element is the volute, or the sort of curl on the top of the Ionic capital that looks like the rolled ends of a scroll, or sometimes it's called ram's horns. The shaft of each column is generally 8 to 9 times as high as its diameter. The Corinthian order is a later development. It has a distinct capital shaped like an inverted bell surrounded by acanthus leaves. You can see the little points of the leaves there on the capital. The capital is the top of the pillar. According to Vitruvius, the Athenian sculptor Callimachus, who banqueted at Corinth, conceived the form when he spied a goblet surrounded by leaves. The style first appears around the end of the 5th century. We will see it much, much later spread widely in medieval art. Its 24-flute column is the tallest of all the orders, with a height 10 times the diameter of the column. In classical Greece, Corinthian columns were rare and were used for interiors. The style's popularity peaks during the Hellenistic period, and the Romans loved it and used it everywhere. And as I said before, it shows up again in medieval times. So the ways to understand these three architectural designs: the Doric columns have capitals that are square or stepped. They have, in the frieze at the top, they generally have a triglyph, which is a little carving of three grooves. In metope, the small little panel there might be decorative elements, there might be some kind of sculpture. In Ionic and Corinthian columns, you don't see the triglyph, but you do have, in the entablature, you would have in the frieze, some kind of decoration on occasion. Each form of architectural column makes for increasingly taller and lighter weight buildings, and that is an element that adds to temples, to add their beauty and their grace. Here's a little bit more detail of the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns. And if you notice, the Doric columns, very plain at the capital. The Ionic columns have this scroll or swirl pattern, sometimes called a ram's horn pattern. And the Corinthian has the curling leaves, very organic, leafy, decorative, curly pattern at the top. One of the ways to remember this for your, when you take your tests, Doric, which begins with a D, is the duller of the styles. It's plain, it's simple. Ionic is more interesting with its curls, and Corinthian is just totally curly and crazy. So if you use those mnemonic devices of the initials of these styles, Doric is dull, Ionic is interesting, and Corinthian is curly or crazy, you'll do well when you get to the test. Here's the Temple of Hera. This is the second Temple of Hera, circa 500 BCE. It's one of the best surviving examples of a Doric temple design, and it's in Paestum, Italy, a Greek colony that flourished during the Archaic period. Paestum is south of Naples, alongside another Greek colony, Neapolis. Greek temples differed in function from most religious shrines of later years. The altar lays outside the temple at the east end, facing the rising sun, and the Greeks gather outside, not inside the building. The temple proper housed a cult statue of the deity, the grandest of all votive offerings. The Greek temple is the house of the god or goddess, not of his or her followers. In Greek temples, followers would meet outside on the porch at the altar. Inside is where the statue of the god is, and it is considered the god's house. Hera, too, is a fine example of an early Doric order temple. The basic Doric temple format is a rectangular marble sculpture encircled by a double row of columns, with a portico at front and rear. A sculptured frieze in the pediments. You can see up here little detailed figures in between the triglyphs in the metopes. And down at the base, you'll see, in the pediment, you'll see also a frieze. The pediment is the triangular piece at the top. This adorns the temple without detracting from the overall simplicity and unity of the design. The temple is intended to be seen as a sculptural unit. Figural sculpture plays a major role in the exterior program of the Greek temple from early times on, partly to embellish the god's shrine, partly to tell you something about the deity within, and partly to serve as a votive offering. This commanding importance of the sculptural temple, its inspiring function in public life, is emphasized in its elevated site, often on a hill above the city, as in the Acropolis in Greece. Columns, usually 6 across the front and rear of the temple, are 4 to 6 times as tall as the diameter of the shaft. 13 columns, the number at the front doubled, plus 1, are on each side. The entablature, or horizontal elements across the top of the columns, is 1/4 the height of the columns. The temple form is sometimes called petrified carpentry, since the Greeks adapted techniques used in wooden construction when they switched to stone. The incised vertical bands called the triglyphs or the three grooves literally are representing the ends of rafters. Probably the most well known of locations for Greek architecture is the Acropolis at Athens. The Acropolis, or is at the Akros, or the high point in Athens. It's on a hill, a little mountain inside the city. This is the location of civic life, as we said in the last lecture. This site has been fortified since Mycenaean times around 1250 BCE. There has been a temple to Athena here since the Archaic period. It also at that time had several other smaller temples or treasuries. In 480 BCE, the Persians demolished the buildings and tore down the statues. For over 30 years, the Athenians left the sacred monuments in ruin, a solemn reminder of Persia's ruthlessness. But in the mid 5th century, Pericles came. Pericles, remember him, first citizen of Athens, came into political life. His ambitions for Athens included making the city, which had at that time a population of about 150,000, the envy of the Mediterranean world. His projects, which the democracy approved, began on the Acropolis. Individually and collectively, the structures here have come to exemplify the classical phase of Greek art at its height. In these monuments, artists continue to grapple with ways of creating harmony through principles of commensurability. Here's a model of the Acropolis. You can see at the top center there the Parthenon and the various buildings, various temples, the main front gate, the open area that is the Agora. All of this at the top of a hill that's about 7 miles across in the center of Athens. The Parthenon, which is the main or largest temple on the Acropolis, is a Doric style temple, which under Pericles was supervised by Phidias and designed by the architects Iktinos and Callicrates. The architects intended the brilliant white marble Parthenon to be the ultimate expression of Athens' grandeur. The temple functioned as a home for Athena and a monument to wealth, power, taste, and piety of Athens. There are two chambers inside. The city's treasury is one, and the other is for a cult statue of Athena. Although everyone can look in from the door, only a few were allowed to enter those chambers. The rituals were held outside at a sacrificial altar to which the Parthenon was the backdrop. In the 6th century, it became a church and remained relatively intact until 1687, when a direct rocket hit destroyed its core. The Parthenon has 8 columns wide, 101 feet, and 17 columns long, 228 feet. The Parthenon's form embodies the Greek ideals of harmony and balance. This image of geometric precision, of equilibrium between vertical lift and horizontal load, results from countless small adjustments. Nothing is truly perpendicular. Everything is slightly off in order to appear to be straight on. Columns lean forward, backward, or sideways to create the illusion of true vertical. And since columns at the end of a row look thinner against the sky, these pillars are 2 inches thicker and clustered 2 feet closer to their neighbors. The metatopes, the square pieces between the triglyphs, which seem to be square, are actually oblong. Despite the seeming chaos of these adjustments, every dimension is proportionally derived from the diameter of a single column. Here we have a view of the metatopes, those sculptures in between the triglyphs, the little 3 grooves at the top of the frieze. And here's another view from the side. Inside of the Parthenon, originally there were sculptures that formed the pediment. They are now in place in the British Museum. Marble sculptures were taken, friezes were taken by the British when they occupied Greece. They're called the Elgin marbles for Lord Elgin, who took them from Greece, and they are currently, you see in the bottom right-hand corner, in the British Museum. Here's a plan of the Parthenon, and you can see that arrangement of the pillars and the sculptures. Those marbles that were carried off by Lord Elgin are in the friezes. The Pantheistic procession frieze, the sack of Troy, is up in the metotropes on that side, and all of these marble pieces that were looted from Greece by the British are still there. There's still a debate between the Greeks and the British as to who should own them. They're still under discussion about returning them to Greece or not. You can see in here the two chambers. The smaller chamber is the treasury, and the larger chamber is where Athenos Parthenos, the statue of Athena, would have been placed. The particular statue of Athena was as tall as the building itself. We saw this in the lecture on Athens. This is a model of it, a reproduction. The ceiling, you may notice, would have been wood beams. The reproduction of Athena here, the Parthenon is on the right, is in Nashville, Tennessee. The Athena that would have been there would have been a large marble sculpture with gold leaf on it, in her hand holding the winged victory, on her other hand a hopalon or shield, and a spear, the symbols of war. In the east pediment, or that triangular sort of form above the frieze above the capitals, on the east side we see the birth of Athena. Down below here is a drawing representing that particular frieze as it would have been in period. Down below you can see some of the figures that are now in the British Museum that were carved off of the pediment and carted away to England. Close-up of the three goddesses. When the Parthenon was converted into a church, much of this decoration on the sacred east side was destroyed or vandalized. Some was destroyed by the Venetians in 1687. Much of the rest was taken to England in the 19th century. Originally, the sculptured figures formed a continual marble frieze depicting processions of horsemen and maidens to honor Athens. The birth of Athena here in the east pediment represents Athena springing from the head of Zeus in the presence of other deities. All but the central figures survive. In the left corner, the body of Helios the sun. On the right corner, Selene the moon. The more than lifelike sculptures on the pediments, such as the three goddesses from the east pediment, are carved fully in the round, even though in ancient times no one would have ever seen the backsides of them. The more than life-size sculptures on these pediments are incredibly organic, that you can see the lines of the draperies. This looks like real cloth. It is beautifully detailed. The surviving Parthenon statues seem to be watching as they participate in the action, as if they are of this world and yet beyond it. This whole sculptural program was likely directed by Phidias, although the actual work done by his workshop. This female group is a masterpiece of swirling drapery, which disguises the sheer bulk of the marble. It's almost a wet look, both concealing and revealing them. But notice that the drapery here doesn't follow the lines of the body so much as struggle with them, twisting around the legs in massive folds. The effect is extraordinary. Although a viewer can only see the deities from a frontal vantage point, as if the figures were two-dimensional, the curves of the deeply cut folds in the cloth echo their forms and therefore broadcast their three-dimensionality. The sculptor could better express nature through the appearance of truth than through truth itself. This is an optical device, a sculptural equivalent of the deliberate distortions in the temple's architecture. This is a model of that Athena Parthenos by Phidias. She was destroyed before the 19th century, but it's known from written descriptions and Roman copies what she would have been like. She was 38 feet tall. Her size was dictated by the dimensions of the Parthenon itself. The Nike in her hand, the figure is made of ivory and gold, supported on a wooden armature. In that alone, it was extraordinarily valuable, and the building's forms drew visitors in to see it. The Nike referred to is the Athenian victory over the Persians in 479 BCE. The memory of the Persian sack of the Acropolis was still vivid when the Parthenon was built, and the Athenians were intensely conscious that by driving back the Persians, they were saving their civilization from Eastern barbarians who had committed atrocities. This statue was by Phidias, the most celebrated Greek sculptor of his time. It and most of Phidias's works are lost. His only surviving sculpture, or perhaps his workshop, are the friezes and pediment statues of the Parthenon, many of which are now in the British Museum. Also commissioned by Pericles in 437 BCE is the Propylaea. This is the gateway on the western edge of the Acropolis. The architect here is Niceles. This stairway and open area with side flanking little temples is steeply pitched and irregular, uses the elements of Doric temples. Only the eastern porch or the eastern facade is in fair condition today. The front resembles a classic Doric temple, except for the wide opening between the third and fourth columns, which allow traffic to pass into the Acropolis. On the western porch are two wings of unequal size because of the terrain. The larger one to the north contained a picture gallery. This is the first known instance of a public room designed specifically for the display of painting. Placed along the central passageway through the Propylaea are two rows of slender Ionic columns, echoing the Ionic columns in the Parthenon. Here's another view of it, and you can see those distinct, the curvature of it around the stairway, the temple-like rooms on the sides, and the gate itself into the Acropolis. Here's a view of those stairs going up the center, and you can see the arch there to the left, which is between the pillars, which takes you into the Acropolis proper. This is a plan of the Erechtheion in the Acropolis. This was built circa 421 to 405 BCE. This is another temple, and this particular building is built on a site that incorporated previous sacred sites. Because of this, it's an asymmetrical temple, unlike the Parthenon. There are several sacred sites here. Number one is a shrine housing a wooden image of Athena, which is in a spot where this is on a spot where Poseidon's trident marked. You'll see number 3. Poseidon struck the earth with his trident, and he smote a rock to bring forth a spring of seawater. This was in his contest with Athena for the city's loyalty. She won by causing an olive tree to sprout, which still grows there at point 2 in the forecourt of the Erechtheion. And then there's ruins of an archaic temple. You can see them here with a sort of dotted lines at the bottom. In the location of where Poseidon's trident struck, there were shrines to a host of other gods and demigods, early kings of Athens, but primarily the Erechtheion is in honor of Athena. Athena's statue would be here in the inner chamber, and this is an interesting piece, mostly because of its different elevations and what great care was taken with the decorative details, perhaps because the rest of the building is so awkward. The most famous part of the Erechtheion is the Porch of Maidens, and we'll see here in the next two details. Here's an external view of those temples. You can see the Porch of Maidens on the right. This is where, instead of columns, now you notice that the other columns are Ionic columns, but those columns on the Porch of Maidens are literally women. Porch of Maidens is named for the 6 caryatids. These are called caryatids, Caryatids, on a high parapet which support the roof. They exhibit the weight shift that was standard for the 5th century. The role of caryatids as architectural supports for the unusual flat roof is underscored by the vertical flute-like drapery folds concealing their stiff weight-bearing legs. Classical architect sculptors successfully balanced dual and contradictory functions of these female statues or columns. Another view of them, these particular columns have enough rigidity to suggest the structural column and just a degree of flexibility needed to suggest the living body. Those folds of drapery look a lot like columns, also look like the human body. Vitruvius wrote that these figural columns represent the women of Caryae, a city-state in Peloponnesia that formed an alliance with the Persians in the Persian Wars. The story goes that when the war was over, the triumphant Greeks killed the men and took the women as slaves, forcing them to retain their fine clothing and other marks of their former status as visible reminder of their shame. The architects designed images of these women to bear the burden of their state's dishonor in perpetuity. However, in reality, these kinds of statues, these kinds of columns caryatids appear in Greek architecture long before the Persian Wars. So Vitruvius may be sort of adding significance to the Athenians after the war as they constructed this porch of maidens, but that's not the original story of the caryatids. Here's another view of them up close and a view from the inside in which you can see the cross beams of the wooden flat roof, the coffered roof that would be on the building. Now we're moving to the Temple of Athena Nike. This little temple dates back to the Mycenaean era. It is on a protruding tall mass of rock, strategically located in a way that protects the southern flank of the most vulnerable access point to the citadel. Early in its history, it was a worship for deities associated with war, the Nike gods or goddesses, which in time fused with the cult of Athena Nike of later centuries. Excavations have revealed that on this location there was once an open pit that existed, that Bronze Age Greeks used to pour libations and deposit primitive human figurines into. During the Archaic era, a small temple stood on the site, and that was destroyed by the Persians in 480 along with the rest of the Acropolis and was not rebuilt until 435 BCE. The classic temple that survived was completed between 427 and 424 BCE. We know from several accounts that it had a statue of Athena Nike in its interior cell, which was made of wood and held a pomegranate in the right hand and a helmet in the left. The temple acquired the name of Nike from that statue. This classical temple is considered considerably smaller than other temples in the Acropolis. It is the first building that greets visitors who approach the Propylaea, and its elegant Ionic features balance the dominating Doric character of the Propylaea. It faces east. Its entrance is lined with 4 monolithic Ionic columns that support a shallow porch. The temple was designed by Callicrates, and it's 11 feet tall from the apex of its pediment to the base of its pillars. It was also decorated with a continual frieze. One last piece of architecture does not seem as much a piece of architecture as an excavation. This is the temple at Epidaurus. In the early 3rd to 2nd centuries BCE, Greek religious ceremony from which we derive theater and drama takes place in amphitheaters like this. This is a large-scale amphitheater. It has a round open area in the center in which plays would have been held. Theaters have long been a part of the religious landscape of Greek cities. The basic requirements for a theater are a hillside on which an audience can sit and a level area for the performance. That round level area in the center we call the orchestra. The essentials gradually take on architectural form, leading to the magnificent stone theater in the sanctuary of the healing god Asclepios at Epidaurus. This form is familiar to every theater goer today as a testament to its success. Row on row of stone seats line the sloping hillside. There are 55 tiers of steeply banked stone seats. To facilitate entry and circulation, the seats are grouped in wedge-like sections separated by staircases. A wide horizontal corridor divides the upper and lower sections. Action takes place in the level circle at the center, behind which a stage building, or skene, serves as a backdrop and contains utility rooms for storage and dressing. Nothing blocks the view of the stage or the landscape. This theater has extraordinary acoustics. Its funnel shape carries even the slightest whisper audibly up to the highest seats. This is the kind of area in which the play that we're going to read next week, Antigone, would have been performed in ancient Greece. So, what are our conclusions here? Why Greeks? Why are the Greeks so well known for architecture? What is it about the Greek architecture and art that survives down the centuries? For one thing, they have an influence on Rome. We will see in Roman architecture many of these same elements, the columns, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. We will see the influence on Italian Renaissance art. And eventually we see its influence in North American art. The two buildings on the far right here include the New York Stock Exchange, which is built on that same model of the Parthenon. And if you notice, when you go to Bucktel Hall or other buildings on campus, you'll notice those same architectural elements. Take a walk out behind the College of Arts and Sciences and look at the pillars there that came off of the old East Hall. Notice that there's an amphitheater in the back of the College of Arts and Sciences. Many of these elements of Greek architecture, Greek sculpture, Greek design, and understandings of forms of art are still with us today in the West. Here's a little test for you. Wander around the city of Akron and see if you can find any columns on buildings. Come back and tell me where the building is located and whether the columns were Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian.